During excavations at former German bases in the east, archaeologists uncovered fragments of diaries, bent cutlery, and faded uniforms, traces of a daily life long forgotten. Each object once belonged to a prisoner of war who lived for years behind these fences. What did everyday life look like for these men? How do you hold on to your humanity when the whole world is at war? Today, we're going back into captivity itself, into the daily struggle to stay alive. Before we step through these gates, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and get ready to witness the reality of World War II prisoner of war camps up close. After surrender came the long road into captivity. Prisoners from many different nations were gathered under constant guard and moved toward processing centers. The marches could last for days in freezing temperatures, with almost no food. The guards kept a strict pace, and any step out of line was met with brutality. Freight cars built for livestock became the standard transport. Most men had no idea where they were going, only that, for them, the war had taken on a new shape. Arrival at the camp marked the start of a new routine. As they got off the trains, each prisoner was registered, searched, and sorted by nationality. Personal belongings were confiscated and uniforms were inspected. At Stalag Luft 3rd, built mainly for Allied airmen, security was especially tight. Intake followed a methodical process run by Luftwaffe officers. For the newcomers, the silence and cold stares of the guards made one thing clear: the fighting was over. Inside the camp, every step was watched. Stalag Luft III followed a strict layout: double lines of barbed wire, guard towers, and barracks arranged in blocks. The day began with a whistle and mandatory roll call. New arrivals were issued a wooden bunk, a metal bowl, and a thin blanket. Survival depended on discipline and on solidarity. In those first days, the hardest battle was accepting that time now moved slowly and that someone else controlled it. Life in the camp was repetitive and tightly controlled. Food was scarce: watery soup, dark bread, and roasted barley masquerading as coffee. Work meant maintenance tasks: digging small trenches, hauling firewood, cleaning the barracks. Every movement was supervised, and the rules were strict. Even so, prisoners created small personal routines: cleaning boots, mending uniforms, writing down their thoughts. Keeping the mind busy became the only way to stay alive inside. As months went by, the prisoners began to reorganize themselves. Groups formed committees for teaching, reading, and documenting daily life. Others watched the grounds, memorized schedules, and studied guard patrol routes. Security was intense, but silence became their strongest weapon. The idea of escape seemed impossible, yet hope started to slip through the cracks in the barracks, along with the cold of the Polish nights. The first digging began under one of the barracks used as a workshop. The goal was simple and nearly impossible at the same time: open 3 tunnels in total secrecy. Earth was removed in tiny amounts and hidden in trouser legs or under the surface of the yard. Tools were fashioned from cans and broken knives. Every inch of tunnel meant a risk of death, but also one more fragment of freedom. The project was given code names: Tom, Dick, and Harry. Over time, the tunnels turned into a complex system. Prisoners built makeshift rails, ventilation lines out of cans and clotheslines, and lighting powered by stolen wire. With every meter dug, sand was removed bit by bit and spread quietly around the camp. The risk of collapse was constant, and the thin air forced them to work in short shifts. Even so, the digging went on night after night, driven by a steady hope of breaking out. After months of work, the tunnels reached nearly 10 meters down and stretched for dozens of meters. The next step was escape prep, forging documents, stitching improvised civilian clothing, and planning timetables. Every paper, every seam was done with extreme care. The barracks went dark early, but underground, hope stayed lit. The organization reached something close to a military operation, and any mistake could cost dozens of lives. By early 1944, the tunnels were almost ready. Routes were measured and every prisoner was assigned a role: diggers, lookouts, forgers, runners. Thin air and brutal cold made the work harder, but no one stepped back. The tension never let up. A single sound out of place could bring everything down. The tunnels were ready to go. The escape list was organized into groups with routes, timings, and roles for each man. Forgers, lookouts, clothing crews, and logistics worked in sequence. Security tightened, and routine inspections became more frequent. The breakout had to happen in a narrow window before winter ended. If you want to follow this operation step by step and understand how it unfolded against all odds, stay with us and stick around until the end of this story. On the chosen night in March 1944, the order to move began. Temperatures were below freezing and the ground was rock hard. Guards and dogs circled the perimeter on a regular schedule. The goal was to get 80 men beyond the wire. The silence was absolute, only measured breathing and precise gestures. On the surface, nothing seemed different. Under the frozen ground, the operation was already underway. While the first escapees vanished into the snow, inside the camp everything stayed quiet. For hours, the plan looked like a success. At sunrise, guards began to notice empty bunks. Roll call revealed the unthinkable. Dozens of men were gone. Chaos hit the camp command. Aircraft and patrols were called in. The manhunt had begun. Within a few hours, the entire region was on alert. Rail lines, roads, and small towns came under tighter control. Bounty hunters and Gestapo units were brought into the search. Some escapees walked for days and made it onto trains heading north. Others were caught in the first villages. For many, freedom lasted only a short time, but the act itself had already become a symbol of resistance. The chase dragged on for days. Hundreds of soldiers, tracking dogs and aircraft swept through forests and villages. The Gestapo took charge. A few escapees managed to reach trains. Others were betrayed, reported by civilians, or picked up by patrols. Almost none of them knew what was coming next. The war had already taken nearly everything, even the right to try to run. Of the 76 men who escaped, only 3 ultimately reached freedom. 50 were executed on direct orders from the German High Command. The camp was reorganized and the tunnel system destroyed. Even so, the act of resistance remained a lasting symbol of courage and ingenuity. Decades later, diaries recovered from beneath the soil of Stalag Luft III would remind the world that, even in captivity, the will to be free was never buried. In early 1945, as Soviet forces pushed west, camps in the east began to empty. Thousands of prisoners were forced to march through one of the harshest winters of the century. When the Red Army finally reached Sagan, Stalag Luft III stood empty. What they found were damaged barracks and the remains of one of the largest escape operations of the war. The excavations brought to light what had been hidden for decades. Fragments of timber, cans used for air ducts, and improvised rails appeared exactly where survivor accounts said they would be. The Harry Tunnel was better preserved than anyone expected. Researchers recognized the level of engineering achieved with almost no tools. Every item lifted from the ground showed just how much effort these men had poured into their plan. The finds confirmed what the survivors had described. The precision, creativity, and courage of the prisoners became even more evident as the tunnels were revealed again, this time for study. The site started to be treated as a textbook example of resistance under extreme conditions. The story preserved in that soil shows just how far human determination can go. Today, this place stands as a living reminder of the skill and courage of the men who were held here. The exposed tunnels, the preserved objects, and the surviving testimonies form a historical record that reaches far beyond its time. The escape was not just an attempt to run, it was a declaration of humanity in the middle of captivity. This ground reminds us that even in the hardest circumstances, the human spirit finds ways to resist.